Welcome. I'm Stephen Young, Assistant Circuit Executive for Public Affairs of the Second Circuit United States Courts. This is September 25th, 2003, and I am joined by Attorney Ralph Johnson to conduct a conversation with the Honorable Roger J. Minor, Judge of the Second Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. This is another in a series of such interviews with Second Circuit judges underwritten by the Federal Bar Council, which Mr. Johnson represents. We are in the Albany chambers of Judge Minor. Your Honor, thank you for this opportunity. Ralph?
Judge, why don't we start out by talking about your professional background, your personal and professional background. Let's start out with talking about how is it that your family came to settle in Hudson, New York?
Well, as you know, Hudson is a very small city, but my father came over with his mother. He was about 7 years old from Europe, a place called Turna in Poland. He was an immigrant, and that was a place in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so they came over here and made their way to Hudson because my grandmother's brother was a merchant in Hudson. And my grandfather, her husband, followed. And so that's how the family, and it soon became an extended family, got to a place called Hudson.
Could you give us a little bit of a background, Judge, on your formative years, your family circumstances, your secondary schools, community, any special activities?
Well, when I was a youngster, I had a pretty happy childhood. I had a brother who was 8 years younger, and we did some things together. But as I grew up, I attended school in Greenport, where my family lived, just outside of Hudson. And then I went to Hudson High School.
These were public schools?
And these were public schools. I was pretty active in school matters. I played in the school band in high school. And
what instrument?
Clarinet and saxophone. And I took lessons for some years. In fact, at one time I contemplated a career in music, but never came to pass. And I played a lot of tennis in those days. My summers were taken up by chores around the house, and when I finished those, I was out on the tennis court every day, won a couple of tournaments as a young player, and enjoyed it very much. So my father was a lawyer, of course, in Hudson at the time, and I enjoyed following him around sometimes and watching what he did, and of course listening to him talk to his clients and study his cases, and I guess that's what piqued my interest in the law early on.
What were your earliest impressions of how law was practiced in those days?
Well, it was a very personal thing. My father had clients. They were usually not corporations or large organizations, although he did work for some small businesses. And practicing law in a small town was a very personal thing because there were personal relationships with people. If a person was your client, he was pretty much your client throughout. And the lawyers were helpful to each other, respected each other. No tricks were ever pulled because we saw each other every day. And so the relationships were very good. In those days, the Bar Association even had a schedule of fees, which was considered very bad form to violate. Now, of course, that's prohibited, but everybody in those days pretty much complied and charged the money that was set out by the Bar Association in its schedule.
What would be the years of your father's practice, generally speaking?
Well, he started pretty much after he graduated law school in 1926.
And what law school was that?
In New York Law School, my alma mater, as well as his. I have a son who also graduated from there, so he practiced regularly until he died in his 80s. We always tell the story that when we brought him to the hospital for his last illness, they asked when he retired, and we said, I guess he just did. So he continued to practice even in his older years when I left the firm and became a judge. So he was well known in the community. One time he ran for city judge in Hudson, and a lot of people still called him Judge, even though he lost the election. But he was quite proud when I got into the judging work.
Ralph,
Judge, let's talk about your college years. What factors influenced you to choose the State University of New York as your undergraduate?
Well, let
college?
me straighten out something about my undergraduate education. I went from Hudson High School to Columbia College at Columbia University, which was then an all-male institution. And I enrolled in a program called Professional Option, which allowed you to do 3 years at the college and then 3 at the law school. Your first year at law school would be considered your last of college, and you get the 2 degrees. I did the first 2 years in the liberal arts and did pretty well there, but I wanted to get at practicing law. So I found at that time that New York Law School was taking people in with a 2-year pre-law course. And so, but the state was issuing what they called the Law School Qualifying Certificate, the LSQC. And you'd have to apply for that and show that you had at least 2 years, and then they would give you a certificate to allow you to apply to law school. Very few schools were accepting that, but New York Law School was one that did accept that in addition to the 4-year degree. So I thought about it at some length and decided to apply. And I talked to my advisor at Columbia about it. He says, I'm sure they'll take it down there. I'm not sure it's such a great idea. But I did go down for an interview, and lo and behold, I was accepted. I found out later, of course, that those who did this would have to embark on an 8-term law course rather than 6 terms. So I had to do 4 years in law school. And it seemed sometimes that I would never get out. But I went all year round and was able to graduate at the age of 21. And would just turn 22 when I was admitted to the bar very shortly after that. So the undergraduate degree from the University of the State of New York, it was called then. The University of the State of New York, I obtained in 1977, which was, I was already on the state Supreme Court. And the University of the State of New York, which later became Regents College, now called Excelsior College, but the University of the State of New York evaluated all my credits from college, from law school, from the Army, from a postgraduate course I took at Brooklyn Law School when I was still in the Army. And they put all those together and they awarded me the BS degree. So I came to that degree by some circular route, having already been long at the bar. But I thought it would be nice to have a BS degree, and so that's a college that awards you degrees based on courses you've taken in different places, and also they have certain courses that you can take with them to arrange for college credits. That's how this came to. It's an unusual situation, but that's how it came about.
So did I understand you to say you were actually awarded your bachelor's degree when you were on the bench already?
Yes, yes, I was already on the bench and long practicing.
When you were at Columbia, were there any professors that stood out to you or
Well,
fond of?
I recall some. There was a fellow named Taylor who taught geology. A fellow named Lobeck. Who I thought I'd take some geology courses, and I enjoyed those. The liberal arts, there was a professor named Franklin who taught contemporary civilization. I enjoyed very much. And humanities. My professor, my advisor was very helpful. His name was Edelstein, taught French, and Professor de Morelos, who taught Spanish, was an influence on me. I enjoyed his teaching methods, and he wrote me a very nice letter of recommendation for law school as well. But in those days, to get into law school, especially with the law student qualifying certificate, you had to have a personal interview, which I did, and recommendations and certain other things. But that's how that came to pass. So I suppose I'm probably the only judge on the court that got his degree long after he graduated law school. But I'm also probably the only judge on the court that is not admitted to practice in the Second Circuit. I've never been admitted to practice there. nor have I ever been admitted to practice in the Northern District of New York, where I sat, right here in Albany. But I was admitted, of course, in the Southern and Eastern Districts and the state, and also, unique to our court, I would think, in the Republic of Korea. I have my certificate of admission to the bar of the Republic of Korea hanging in the other room, and I've always been proud of that.
I'd like to hone in a little bit on your experience in New York Law School, memories of your instruction, of your instructors there, and an account of your service as managing editor of its law review.
Well, I enjoyed law school tremendously. When I walked in there the first day, I knew that I was in the right place. And even though I had to take every course that there ever was created for law school to fill in 8 terms of law, I enjoyed every one of them. I had to take 1 or 2 courses at night just to make sure that I could get all the credits necessary. But there were some outstanding professors then, and as a matter of fact, there was one left over from my father's day named Max Reich. He was a European scholar who came over here, and was an excellent teacher, still had a heavy accent, but I remember him well, and my father had him as a professor, and I had him. We had a kind of a very interesting adjunct faculty in those days. There were a lot of practicing lawyers who taught, and one of them was William Kunstler, the famous civil rights lawyer who became a civil rights lawyer. He's an excellent professor. He taught some property courses. He and his brother had a small practice in Manhattan in those days. It was before he got such acclaim for his civil rights work. Another very famous adjunct professor in those days was Roy Cohn, the famous Roy Cohn of McCarthy Day fame and Latter Day fame. He was a brilliant young fellow. He used to commute to Washington in those days. He had been an assistant U.S. attorney. He would come into the classroom, and he had a photographic memory. He taught criminal procedure, and he knew it like the back of his hand. And I got to know him, and I got to renew my friendship with him in later years, at which time, I must say, provided some assistance to me in my quest for a federal court appointment. So those were important professors. The dean then was Allison Reppy, who had come from NYU to take over in the school. There's a professor there, Koffler, who still is alive and who I'm in touch with, taught torts. These people all made an important impression on me. There was a professor named Subotic. Professor Ivan Subotic taught international law. He was a member of the French bar, and he had been ambassador from Yugoslavia to the United States. He was deposed during the communist takeover. He was a brilliant fellow, although also very hard to understand. There was a Professor Olek who taught the debtor and creditor law on a regular basis. He'd written some books about that subject. There was a professor there, it's kind of peculiar that his name presently escapes me, who taught admiralty law. I ended up taking admiralty law, you know. All my fellows kidded me about admiralty. I said, well, I live on the Hudson River. There's some ships that go up there. So, but this, he was a young fellow just out of the Navy, very knowledgeable about admiralty law, and I remember his course very well. And I'm sorry I don't remember his name, because it was only a few years ago that he appeared as quite an elderly gentleman before me in the Second Circuit in an admiralty case. And I said, did you teach as an adjunct professor at New York Law School in the course of admiralty? And he said, yes, I did. I said, well, you taught me. He says, well, I hope you remember. Unfortunately, he lost the case. But he was one who left some memory. There was a Professor Ash, Sidney Ash, who was then an assemblyman, became a state Supreme Court judge and appellate division judge, who was teaching there at that time. Professor Silverman, who came from NYU also, was the dean to teach there. Professor Dugan, who taught contracts, an excellent teacher, and I remember him giving the introductory orientation course, in which he explained about the law and how how you'd have to study very hard and work very hard. And he used a term that would be very politically incorrect today. I mean, we're talking about 1953 to 56 is when I attended the school. He said, "Gentlemen, because I don't think there are any women in the room at all, the law is a jealous mistress." And we all took that very much to heart, that we had to work very hard, but I don't think the term is a correct one to be used today. But at least they made the impression on you that the study of law required application. And in those days, at New York Law School anyway, they had what they call comprehensive examinations. And at the end of each year, you would be tested on all the courses you have studied that year, and the next year would be all the courses you have studied for the 2 years, and the same in the 3 years. The questions cut across all the areas of law. And it was a wonderful preparation, we thought, for the bar examination. The law review was started up, actually, or the present form of the law review was started. They had some off and on law reviews at the law school the year I was there. In fact, the first issue was dedicated to John Marshall Harlan, Second Circuit judge, who was on the circuit for about a year before he was appointed to the Supreme Court. He was appointed to the Supreme Court the year of our issue. And so I was the first managing editor. I was a very young fellow at the time. And I worked under an editor-in-chief called Richard Burns, who later became a well-known lawyer in the entertainment industry. And I made some good lifelong friends on the law review, and I think that's why that today when I hire law clerks, I always insist that they have law review experience, because I think it's very important for a number of reasons. It teaches them how to do research in depth, how to write citations, and they help us with memos and opinion drafting when they become clerks in our chambers. And they learn how to work together, which is also an important thing. We've always had more than one clerk in chambers. The senior judges only have 2, but the actives now have 4. And so collegiality among the clerks is an important thing. And I think you learn that on the law review. Just a year ago, my closest friend and longest friend passed away. He was one of the editors on the law review where I first met him. He was an engineer graduate of Lehigh, an mechanical engineering graduate, and he went to law school with me, went into patent practice with his father in those days. And he got into intellectual property. I enjoyed his friendship over many years. He got to represent some companies in Germany and Japan, and we always had a good time when we were together. So I think one of the most valuable experiences in law school is law review. And I certainly would encourage any law student to do it. It's usually, it's a little bit different now. In our day, we were chosen strictly on the basis of grades. Now I understand there are a lot of law schools where you can write, they write on to the law review. You write something for them, and they evaluate it. And even though your grades may not be tip-top, you may show some talent as a writer and be chosen for law review.
Ralph?
Judge, how is it that you came to join the Army directly out of law school and then serve in the JAG Corps?
Well, that's another story. I was deferred deferred from the draft during my school years. And so when I got out of the law school, as a matter of fact, when I got out of law school, I was looking for a job in New York at the time.
And just to set this historically, even though it was peacetime and the Korean War had reached its armistice, there still was a draft.
There still was a draft, that's right. The war had just worn down, but there was a draft. And so people still got deferments to finish their education with the understanding they'd have to go to be drafted later. So the Army I didn't join the Army. The Army joined me, so to speak. And what happened was I was in the city. First thing I wanted to do was to clerk for John Marshall Harlan. I was a pretty good student at the law school, and he was a graduate of our school. But he would not consider graduates of our school. And I vowed at that time that if I ever got to be a judge, I certainly would take clerks. And I have, over the years, some 20 clerks in my law school. But so when that fell through, I had a job interview lined up with the firm of Louis Nizer, who was then a very
Oh, yes.
active trial lawyer in New York, and I very much wanted to do trial work, and so I talked to one of the people in his office, and I was about to be interviewed, and then I got a letter from my father who said he was very busy, and since I had graduated from law school now, if I would like to, should go up with him. And so I said, I always admired, revered my father. He was my principal mentor all my life, so I packed up and went back to Hudson and started practicing law, knowing that my deferment had run out, and it was just a matter of time that I would be drafted. And so I was. I was drafted. I was drafted into the Army. I went through the reception center here in Albany, went to Fort Dix, and went to Fort Knox for basic training. And so I had a law degree, and I was involved in basic training, and Fort Knox was then, I think still is, the armored center. They handle the tanks and all the armored vehicles and teach people how to use them down there. And I was interested in that, and in fact later took some courses in armored warfare. But after my completion of basic training, they assigned me to Fort Lee, Virginia. And so at Fort Lee, Virginia, they took us in a bus from the airport and onto the base, and in my case, to a particular outfit called 510th. It was a sign outside. It said 510th QM Quartermaster Company, BKRY. And I said, gee, must be an intelligence unit. They're going to make use of my talent here. Well, it was a mobile field bakery unit. And what they did was pack up their equipment and go into the field and bake bread when the troops were in the field. And the sergeant told us it was a great unit to be in because we'd be next door to the ration breakdown, and we could swap them bread for food, and we'd be eating like a king. He was quite a pot-bellied fellow himself, and he seemed to enjoy that work. The company commander, the lieutenant, came to me eventually and said, you've got too much education to go out and bake bread. I think I'll make you the assistant company clerk. So I was designated assistant company clerk in that outfit and stayed there for a while. Now, before that time, maybe before I was drafted, while I was still those few months practicing with my father, I had filed an application and been interviewed here in Albany for a commission in the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Obviously hoping that it would come through before I had to leave for the draft, but it didn't, and I went through all of this. And during my stay in the Fort Lee, I was in the barracks one night, and the sergeant came in and saluted me. And I said, what's that? He said, you've just been commissioned lieutenant in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, first lieutenant. And he said, I remember his words, he said, it wouldn't be kosher to you live in the barracks with the enlisted men. Now you got to go. So I had my orders, and they directed that I report on a certain day to the Judge Advocate General School in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so I remember flying home, and I took my mother, and we went down to West Point to buy some uniforms. I said, I want a set of first lieutenant's uniform. And the guy looked at me like I was crazy because I'm supposed to know what they look like and what I wanted to buy. But so he fitted me up, and I put on the uniform as best I could, and I headed for Charlottesville. And the law course for judge advocates was given at the University of Virginia Law School on the campus at the University of Virginia, where the JAG school was also located. And so we took courses over there in military law of all kinds. It was a 3-month course. A lot of my colleagues had gone directly from civilian life into the military, and I ragged them a lot about not knowing what military life was like. I was a veteran of about 6 months of enlisted time, and we had some fun there in the JAG school. I remember one of my colleagues walking into the restaurant, the mess there one day, and he had his brass upside down. And, you're supposed to have the U.S. On top and the insignia of Judge Advocate General underneath. He had them reversed. So he walked past, we had some regular Army guys there, officers who were training us about military procedure. And he walked past the major, and the major said to him, you've got your brass on upside down. He says, okay, fella, thanks. He continued on his way. And when he was finished, he came back, his breast was still upside down. And the major went out of his mind. He told him, don't get excited, you know. He said, look, this is the Army. You're a lieutenant. I'm a major. When I tell you something, you've got to do it. So it was a big change for a lot of those lawyers to learn about how it worked there. One of my classmates at the JAG school was a fellow who had just finished clerking for Hugo Black. And I enjoyed talking to him about Justice Black and about how he played tennis with him. That was one of his jobs as clerk, to go over to Justice Black's house, and he had a court there, and he played tennis with him. But at the end of that session, we were asked to choose where we'd like to go to serve. And being a young fellow and wanting to see the world, I said I'd like to go overseas, and I'd like to go to the Far East, to Japan particularly. So lo and behold, one of the rare things in the Army, they let me go where I chose, and they sent me to Camp Zama, Japan. And I went over there, and I was assigned immediately to the U.S. Army Claims Service, Far East. And it was like a big insurance company processing claims, but a lot of them were under the status of forces agreement with Japan. So I had a chance to work a lot with the Japanese Bengoshi. They are the lawyers in the government. And when Japanese civilians were injured or something, we would process their claims. We also processed claims for servicemen and so forth. But I got a little itchy about it because although it was some interesting tort work, I wanted to try cases. I always wanted to be a trial lawyer. That's the main thing I wanted. And I kept telling the people in the military that I wanted to be a trial lawyer. So eventually there came into my possession orders to report to Korea, to the judge advocate of the 7th Infantry Division. Now, Camp Zama was a headquarters, Army headquarters. This was a division in the field. So I went up to Camp Zama, Japan, a place called Tongdushan, and pretty soon I was trying general court-martial cases in the Quonset huts. It was still kind of rough living up there after the war, and still some snipers running around firing off guns every once in a while. But basically, we were doing general court-martial work. And we had in our Quonset hut, in a glass case, manual for courts-martial that had a big bullet hole in it. And so to save somebody's life, at least the law was good for something, you know. So I had a number of interesting cases there, and was able to get the trial experience I liked. Although, you know, the living conditions were all not that good. I'd go down to Solar once in a while, about a 30-mile drive along a hugely dusty road. You get down there covered with dirt. When I was in Japan, it was easy living. We had a lot of help, and we enjoyed the area very much. We had a beautiful officers club on the base, and I used to hang around down at the bar at the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. I thought, boy, this is good. Maybe I'll be a career military man. But then they sent me to Korea, and I said, maybe a career in this is not all that great. So, but I did get experience, as I say, and I had some interesting cases there. I remember there were a lot of cases we had of when the servicemen would assault local civilians for one reason or other. They got involved with women there, and there were thefts and so forth. So I had the gamut of cases to prosecute, although when I first got there and they put me on the prosecution end in JAG, I lost a couple of cases, which in those days was unheard of for a prosecutor in the Army. So they put me on defense for a while until I could get some better experience.
Judge, maybe you can describe some of your memorable cases from the JAG for us.
Well, I remember a case where that I was prosecuting that I lost. A young Korean woman was beaten very badly by one of the soldiers, and they had to airlift her from the hospital in Seoul up to the division where we had a court-martial, and they brought her on the pod of a helicopter. So I had to fly her outside and she was really banged up, and they wheeled her into the courtroom, and I asked her to identify the assailant, and she was unable to do it. She gave the response that most Americans look alike to me, and I don't know who he is. So that was pretty much the end of that case, and I thought it was too bad because I was sure we had the right man. I remember another case, I don't remember the facts of the case, but I remember trying to find a witness. And I took a Korean policeman with me who spoke some broken English, and we went looking for the witness and found him in a rice field. And he was up to his knees planting rice, and the Korean spoke to him, and I tell him he has to come testify. So the policeman came back and said, he say no come. I said, please, urge him to come. It's important to my case. Comes back and says, he say he no come. I said, this case is going nowhere unless this guy testifies, and so we might as well leave because he's the key witness. So I turn around to leave, and I see him pushing the guy into the rice paddy. The guy stands up, and he pushes him 2 or 3 more times, and then he catches up with me, and he said, he say he come. So I think they have persuasive ways of doing business. I suppose the most important case I handled was as a defense counsel to a civilian named Mounts. Mr. Mounts was in Korea with the Vanell Corporation of California, which had a contract to construct some power lines and the reconstruction of Korea. And he had the benefits of a military officer. He used military and bachelor officer quarters. He had a right to use the mess and the post exchange. So he was treated in that way by virtue of the Vanell contract. He also had a girlfriend in Seoul that he kept in a little house down there. And on this one occasion, he was constrained to pay the Korean employees of Vanell. And so the Army cut a check to him, and instead of taking that check to the Army paymaster, he was able to get it cashed in Seoul, where he got double the won to the dollar that he would have got from the paymaster. So he had enough full money to pay off the Koreans, plus he had half again as much for himself. That apparently was a violation of a currency regulation that was then in effect. So they decided to prosecute him for this. And the first thing they did was to take his passport away so he couldn't leave the country. And I marched in to see the commanding general. Now, it's quite a daunting thing when you're a first lieutenant. You see a fellow with some stars on his shoulder to tell him that he's done something illegal. I showed him the provision of the U.S. Code that says, you can't go around lifting people's passport. And he said, if you don't want to get in any trouble, Lieutenant, you'll get out of here and leave this problem to me. So the military being what it was, I had to leave and try the case. So I defended Mr. Mounts, and he was duly convicted by a court-martial. And I urged the court that there was no jurisdiction over this civilian, although the ancient George Washington regulation said sutlers, retainers, and those who follow the army are subject to jurisdiction. They convicted him anyway. They didn't sentence him any prison time. They just deported him from the country and got rid of him. And but his case went on appeal, as I knew it would, to the intermediate court in the military system. And the conviction was reversed on a ground that I had also urged, which was that the Army, in its infinite wisdom, as in any bureaucracy happens, had inadvertently repealed the regulation, the currency regulation under which he was tried. So he got to go free. But beyond that, some years later, I was pleased to learn that the Supreme Court had determined that in time of peace, there's no jurisdiction of court-martials over civilians. And that has been the law, I believe, ever since. But I had one of the earlier cases. It wasn't recognized, but didn't have to go any place after they had reversed his conviction. But it was an interesting matter for me because you seldom get to defend a civilian when you're in the military service. After I finished in Korea, I asked to get as close to home as possible, and so I spent the last a year, or a little less than a year of my term, which consisted of 3 years, by the way, 3.5 years. I did about a half a year in the enlisted rank, and they told me that if I took the commission, I had to spend 3 more years. The draft would only have kept me for 2, but I took the commission and ended up doing 3.5, and I wasn't sorry for it. So I spent my last year or so in Governor's Island, which was First Army Headquarters in those days, and I did considerable trial work because they would send people over from Europe who were abandoning, who were deserters or people who had gotten into trouble. I remember one night I was in my office late in Governor's Island, and a young fellow came and was sweeping out the office. He was on the prison detail, and I asked him what he was doing. And he said he was a captain over in Germany and a commander of a unit, and he got involved with the colonel's wife, and he stole some money from cash from the safe, and they went around Europe together. And I said, gee, that wasn't a very smart thing to do, was it? He said, well, it turned out it wasn't a very good idea. So he was one of the cases that I prosecuted. I had a number of matters there at Governor's Island, kept busy almost every day on trial. One little anecdote from my enlisted days, they took us out on a bivouac, and we were out in the way out in the woods, having marched out there with all our equipment. And I went down, after we stopped, we were going to make camp, I went down a ravine to heed the call of nature. And when I came back up, I saw the sergeant there, and he had a swagger stick, and he was patting himself with it. And he said, what are you doing down there? I said, I had to go to relieve myself. He says, well, you ought to know that when we're in the field, you don't do that until we build the proper sanitary facilities. And because you violated that concept, you've got to take your entrenching tool and dig a hole 6 by 6. Now, that was considered punishment in those days, dig a hole 6 by 6. My entrenching tool was a little shovel that you carried on your backpack, and I had to dig a 6 by 6 hole. So I've been there digging the hole, and I dug a hole 6 foot wide and 6 foot long, about 1 inch deep. And the lieutenant came along and said, what are you doing? I said, the sergeant told me to dig a hole 6 by 6 as punishment. And I said, here it is. It's 6 wide and 6 long. He said, it's only 1 inch deep. I said, that's right. He didn't say 6 by 6 by 6. So he said, that's right. He says, okay, you can go. And ever after that, the sergeant kept telling everybody about that smart-ass lawyer that dug the wrong size hole. But after I finished at Governor's Island, I got in a car and bought a new car down there. An old car was a Renault Dauphine, what they called a Furlac transmission. It had all the gears but no clutch. And it was kind of an interesting car. And then I drove home and took up my my work once again in my father's office.
Yes, and actually you segued right where I wanted to go. I'd like if you would talk about your years in private practice from 1959 to 76.
Well, we did all kinds of things. We never had more than 3 lawyers and 2 secretaries in the office. My father and I were kind of, in a certain sense, counsel to the profession. We did a lot of trial work. I called on my experience as a JAG, and I followed my father to court very frequently. He was very, very adept in the courtroom. But we represented all kinds of people. And, we did a lot of work in real estate. We did matrimonial work, domestic relations. We did tort work, accident cases, some bankruptcy. As a matter of fact, very little in the federal courts. Most of our stuff was in the estate courts, the litigation part of it, litigation end of our practice. But we did estates. We did almost anything. And the practice grew and prospered. The peculiar part about everything that occurred during those years was that the public service positions I had were all part-time in those days. So I could maintain and build a practice as well as be involved in these matters of public service.
Judge, perhaps you can share some of your memories from being Corporation Counsel of the City of Hudson and then later, then being a prosecutor in Columbia County.
Well, it was kind of an interesting proposition to start out as Corporation Counsel of the City of Hudson. I was in practice with my father about 2 years when a newly elected mayor of Hudson called me and said I'd been recommended to him by another lawyer who had served some years ago in the position, and would I like to be his Corporation Counsel? Because that's a confusing term to many, but it means just the counsel for the corporation, which is the city, and some places call it city attorney. New York City still calls it Corporation Counsel. And so I launched on to the work of a city attorney with this new mayor with whom I became a good personal friend. And so I was the sole representative of the city in court. In those days, the city had no insurance covering its sidewalks and some of its other possessions. It had, of course, automobile insurance. So I did a lot of defense work for the city, and also advised the city council on the resolutions and local laws and ordinances that they wish to draw up. And I was a member of the cabinet and met every month with the mayor and other department heads to review the status of the city. And we did a lot of things, I think, that were worthwhile and improving the city. It was a satisfactory kind of a job. And I do want to emphasize that I've enjoyed everything I've done in the law from the day I started. And this was an enjoyable work, as it was. I did the city's civil legal work. And up until the time, I think it was for about 3 years, when the district attorney of Columbia County called upon me to be an assistant. And I talked to the mayor about it. I managed his second campaign, by the way. I did some political work there. I was his campaign manager.
Which mayor was this?
He won all the awards in the city. His name was Samuel T. Wheeler, Samuel Tilden Wheeler. His son does some of his video work. I don't know if these fellows know him. But I took the job. The county judge was a fellow named Warren Zettel. I mean, the county district attorney. And worked with him as his only assistant. He was part-time. I was part-time. The county was about 50 or 60,000 strong. But we were able to handle the cases and take care of things. Now, of course, the district attorney's office is a full-time job. I'm amazed at how it grew, but
Again, this is Columbia County.
yeah, Columbia County, and Hudson is the county seat. He was defeated in elections, Zettel, about 6 months after I started with him. So we were both out of a job. He came up here to Albany, became counsel to the Dormitory Authority, and did some other work until he came back later to run for county judge, to which he was elected. But I had my practice, so I went back to it, and then I was able to handle criminal work again because I was no longer affiliated with the district attorney's office. Well, there came a time then that the district attorney who had defeated Zettel, John Connor, who is now a state Supreme Court judge, he decided he wanted to run again for district attorney. And so his assistant threw in his hat, and my party prevailed upon me to run against him. I wasn't so keen on it, but I undertook it. And my wife was my campaign manager. She was always very active in politics, as was I.
As a Republican.
Yeah, and we won. And I continued to serve as district attorney part-time. I built the office up till about, I had 2 or 3 assistants. I think I have 9 now. I got $7,500 a year for my part-time job as district attorney. I think the job now pays $120,000. But the county hasn't really grown all that much, but I suppose maybe there's more crime around or something. I don't know. But as district attorney, We covered all the courts, the local courts, the city court in Hudson, and of course the county court, where the felonies were tried. And as district attorney, I wasn't an executive district attorney, didn't have enough help to be that way. So when the serious felonies came along, I tried them. I tried murder cases, traffic ticket cases, almost every kind of case. I was in the courtroom constantly as district attorney, and I think I did a pretty good job. The second time I ran, there was a token opposition. The third time I didn't have any opposition at all. So we were pretty busy, and the cases that we had in that respect were interesting. They gave me the opportunity not only to try cases, but to handle appeals here in the appellate division in Albany. And ultimately, an important case that went to the Court of Appeals that I'll always remember was a woman named Lenore Coons, shot her husband to death, and went to trial, and I prosecuted that case, and the jury convicted, and it was affirmed in the appellate division, and went to the Court of Appeals for argument. And I'll never forget, the brief was written by a professor at Albany Law School. I must have had a class project. It was a huge brief. I don't think I've finished reading it yet, but it's his theory was that since the woman, since she was, the defendant was a woman, she had a greater right to use deadly force than a man would. And I don't know where he came up with that theory, but I remember one of the judges on the court turning to him and saying, "Well, Professor, I like that theory because I'm a small man, and maybe I would have a greater right to use deadly force." He said, "But I don't think that's the law." And so the case was affirmed on appeal. And I got a chance to, in those days that I was doing litigation, I tried a lot of cases to juries, commercial cases, tort cases, and then I got to argue some appeals in those cases, and also in cases involving political controversies where I represented the Republican Party. I became counsel to the New York State Young Republican Association, and a friend of mine was president, and we worked pretty hard on our political work as well as our legal work.
After you had served as a district attorney, can you review the process by which you became a candidate for New York Supreme Court Justice in 1976, and description of your electoral campaign in the 3rd Judicial District and your recollections of life on the state bench?
Well, the 3rd Judicial District, of course, consists of 7 counties in this area. Albany, where we are now, Rensselaer, Columbia Green, Schoharie, Ulster, and Sullivan, all the way down to Sullivan, Monticello. Kind of a drawn-out area. Now, I'm coming from a small county of that group, and so there hadn't been a Supreme Court justice chambered in Columbia County for 50 years because there just wasn't enough political clout to get it going. Well, then it came to, in the year that I ran, it came to the attention of my wife and my political friends that one of our
and this is 1976.
Yeah, well, I started it, I took office in 76. The campaign was in 75, wasn't it?
Okay.
And he was county chairman of Ulster County, and a friend of ours, and he said he might at least wave to our county and give us his votes at the Judicial Nominating Convention. In the state, you know, it's kind of a peculiar system. New York has the Judicial Nominating Conventions, and delegates go to this convention in September and choose the party's candidate.
And how are these delegates selected? How does that
Well,
work?
they're supposed to be, you know, you can vote on them, but basically the county leaders of the political party selects them. And they pretty much do what they're told. So to get his votes, or the votes of his delegates, was a big thing. And so then we went around to see the other county Republican chairmen in the 7 counties and lined some of them up. The Republican chairman of Columbia County then was a good friend of mine, John Sharp, and he put in a big effort Marianne Fish, who's a widow of Congressman Fish, in those days was very active and a good friend of mine. She was the president of the State Young Republicans. She put in a lot of work on it, and my wife did too. And finally, it came around the convention in September, and it appears I had enough delegates to be a candidate. And it was there was another candidate too from my party, two from my party and two from the Democrats. I had the conservative endorsement, so did my running mate. And he was a judge who had served many years and had been on the appellate division, but was defeated in a Democratic landslide a couple of years before. So he was an older fellow and didn't campaign much. But we only had from September to November to campaign. And my wife was standing by near a place where they manufactured the buttons and labels. And as soon as I called her and told her I had the nomination, the guy started printing, and we were off and running. And that night, in fact, we went to a big Republican affair as a candidate. And then we did a tireless piece of work for the next number of weeks till we got to the voting day. And we had a big recreational vehicle that we traveled the district in. You know, it's good we could change clothes. It had a restroom. We could make food in there. So we were always on the move. And it was like a big billboard, too, with the liner for the Supreme Court on it. And we were moving around the district and soliciting votes. Lance Wheeler was a big help to us in those days with his public relations stuff. I did a lot of television advertising, which was new. It was kind of a different kind of campaign. It was a very hotly contested campaign. And it was very difficult for me, being from a small county, to overcome places like Albany, which always had a strong Democratic majority. And so it was really a contested election.
What were your television ads like?
Well, I had one ad I remember with a picture of with a drawing of the 7-county area, and I say it's bigger than any congressional district, you know. And so we used to get them on sometimes. You could get an ad on in those days, a local ad at the Super Bowl game for like $100. And you know, we spent some money on the campaign, but not a whole lot, because we mostly had friends and relatives working for us and getting out there and soliciting the votes. They worked very hard for us. It was a real political campaign. And I had a fellow, a friend of mine from Westchester County named Carmine Constantinople. We called him Lefty. He was a retired cop, and he drove my van all over. Now, in those days, I had a mustache, and he had one too, and people would wave to him thinking it was me in the van. So we could cover a lot of places at once. I remember one time they were running a TV ad, and one woman, I was talking to her at her house, soliciting a vote. She says, "How can you be here? You're on television." Well, they have a thing, you know, that they can do. So I won. I led the ticket, but by the margin of the conservative endorsement, a couple thousand votes. It was a very close call. But my father was very happy with it, even though I had to leave the firm finally. He always admired the state Supreme Court bench and its judges, and to him it was a big thing. As I say, he was an immigrant boy. He was the first Jewish lawyer to practice in Columbia County, experienced some discrimination. So he took it as a great honor. And so for the, I guess the 6 years that I served on that court, I was able to, you know, I used to have lunch with him on Saturday, and we talk about cases and things. But eventually, I got to hear and deal with a broader variety of cases that I had even in my practice. And that's what being a judge does. It exposes you to different areas of law. And so I got to do things that I didn't, or handle cases that I didn't handle as a lawyer. I sat a lot here in Albany, and of course here they bring frequently Article 78 petitions challenging state agency decisions and so forth. So I got to do a lot of those. And we had commercial cases of type different than I had been used to.
How long was your term for that you were elected?
14 years. 14 years, and it had been in the area, in this area, it's not uncommon to have cross endorsements. That is, both parties agree, they make deals, you take this one, I'll take that one. And that didn't happen in the year I ran, but usually after a 14-year term, although not even always, the other party will cross endorse because you've been there so long. There's a mandatory retirement age in New York of 70, and that applies to all the judges in New York. The Supreme Court judges can be renewed for 3 2-more-year terms, although their seats are considered vacant. They can serve extra, something like our senior judges, but New York Court of Appeals at age 70 have to leave, and I think it's probably kind of a drawback. I know that a lot of the New York judges aren't happy that they have to leave the bench, and that's one of the great things in our system,
The
where
federal
you can be
system.
a senior judge. Yes, in the federal system, you're appointed for life, and if you have the health and the desire, you can keep at it, and so that's a wonderful thing about it.
Judge, is there any particularly salient case from your days as a state Supreme Court justice you'd like to recall?
Well, of course, I handled a lot of interesting cases that involved state action and cases that involved individual people. And one of the good things about being a trial judge is you feel you can help certain situations out, and that's very satisfying. The one case that sticks out in my mind, of course, is the Central Hudson Gas and Electric case that went from me to the United States Supreme Court. And that was a case involving commercial free speech. And it was satisfying because the state courts reversed me and the Supreme Court came out on my side. So, you know, you always remember, it's like lawyers generally. I remember practicing law, and I know it's true today. You always love the judges who decide in your favor, you know. And he's a great scholar and a fine man and high moral principles. Holds against you, he's an idiot, he doesn't know what he's doing, upside down.
What was the central issue in that case?
Commercial free speech, the insertion of advertising type material in the billings.
Right.
But
And what had you held?
I held you could do it. There was such a thing as commercial free speech. Now, it's very limited, of course, but there is such a thing. But, you know, really it was in the federal courts that you really got into really got into some really important kinds of issues and cases.
Judge, that's a good segue. Let's talk about the selection process and to your appointment to the federal district court.
Well, I think it's good to be very frank about this process. You know, a lot of people I've met along the way try to kind of dress it up. The process of appointment to the federal bench is a political one, no matter how you cut it. There are a lot of good lawyers out there, a lot of outstanding lawyers, but unless you know a politician, you're not going to get an appointment to the federal bench. And there has to be some connection, basically, with the United States Senator, on the district court level I'm talking about now, because it's the senator of the president's party who recommends to the president. This goes back to George Washington's time. Obviously, he didn't know anybody throughout the country, but even the colonies, but he knew the senators people became senators, and their appointments were and their recommendations were generally accepted. Now, presidents don't accept all the senators' suggestions, certainly, if they feel there's some reason not to, because there's a big vetting process that goes on, which I'll talk about in a little while. But in the initial choice, there has to be that connection somehow, through a friend, through a political acquaintance, through somebody. Now, I first noted the vacancy here in the Northern District. Now, this is a small district, and vacancies don't come around too often. Judge Foley, about whom I'm will speak later,
Yes.
and after whom this courthouse is named, took senior status, and there was a vacancy. He was here alone in Albany for many, many years. Of course, we have officer courts in Syracuse as well, and Binghamton, but he was here alone in Albany. He was the voice of the federal court in Albany for many years. And I read in the paper that he had taken senior status, and that Senator Jacob Javits, then the senator, was receiving applications from interested applicants for the federal district judgeship that he might put before a committee that he had appointed and make recommendations to the president. Well, I got my application in. I spoke to Senator Javits, didn't know him very well. I appeared before his committee, and lo and behold, before he could make a recommendation, he was defeated in the primary election by Senator Alphonse D'Amato. And so then it fell upon D'Amato to make a recommendation to fill a vacancy here in Albany. There was a Republican president just taken office, President Reagan. There was D'Amato had just taken office. And it was a whole new structure. D'Amato set up his own committee to consider appointments. And once again, I went forward with an application. It was kind of, it came to pass in those days that Senator Moynihan was a Democrat, and Senator D'Amato had kind of an agreement, so that it was a very good thing. It was not only Republicans who got appointed, but Democrats as well. And they got along very well in that process. But getting back to what happened to me, D'Amato became the senator, and my wife knew him and had worked for him. And so she brought his name to my name to his attention. There's no question about that it happened that way. Now, of course, I think I was pretty highly qualified for the job. I was marked qualified eventually by the Bar Association. But to get that initial step, I had to have the political connection, and that was it. So he told her, well, I'll put him before my committee, and I certainly will give him high consideration if they pass him. So I went to the committee. They did what they had to do, and he decided to put my name in and send it to the president. Now, the president's men in those days, President Reagan's people, were very particular about who they wanted appointed to the court, and they weren't necessarily ready to accept any senator's recommendation. So then there became a long vetting process by the Justice Department, by the people who advised the president, and eventually by the American Bar, of course, who in those days made their recommendations to the president. Today they only make them to the Senate because the president says he doesn't want to hear from the But that's a whole different story. In those days, that's the way it went down. And then they took you to Washington for a particular interview with the Deputy Attorney General. And I went through that process. And they were new at it in those days because this was only the beginning. I was one of the very first appointees of the Reagan administration. My wife worked for him too, by the way. So there we are with the possibility of appointment. And finally, the word comes through that I'm being offered the appointment, and of course the commission, and but before that, an appointment with the Senate Judiciary Committee. And in those days, Strom Thurmond, who was a young boy of about 75, was presiding at the Judiciary Committee. It was a Republican-controlled committee. I heard him speak one time. He says, "President, send your name over here. I'm going to put you through." So he threw me a couple of softball questions. At that time, I was to face him once again later when I was nominated for the Circuit Court. I had to go there at that time, too. But I was fortunate that my application was to the Senate Committee for Confirmation was sponsored by Republicans and Democrats. A number of congressmen up here with whom I was acquainted came to speak for me, and Hamilton Fish, a good friend for years, who was a congressman here, and Jerry Solomon, and
It's also a congressman.
yeah, congressman, and Ben Gilman, who just left Congress after being chairman of the International Law Committee. And these are all friends of mine. Ben was a graduate of New York Law School, and the senators also. And Senator Moynihan made a personal appearance, and I remember him. He was very florid in his speech. Or Moynihan got carried away often. He says, and Judge Miter was a Supreme Court judge. Speaking of my experience in the state court. So, of course, aside from the fact that it was very difficult to understand Senator Thurman because he had a very heavy Southern accent. I remember when he said, when he called us up to the table, he said, "Judge Miner? You mind it?" And I'm looking around, you know. I said, "Come round." So I came round and sat at the table, and he says, "I see you have the 2 senators from your state. That's very important here." Important, the way he put it. And then the question he asked me is, Judge Miner, he said, "Do you believe a judge should make law or interpret law?" I didn't know what he was saying. Make law, interpret law. You make law or interpret the law, you know. So I said, well, I knew the answer he wanted, but I said, well, we interpret the law. You make the law here. We interpret the law. And I remember Senator Simon from Illinois at that time was sitting there, too, with the committee, and he says, "But not always. Is that right?" I said, "Yes, not always. I'm trying to keep everybody happy on that and get out of there, you know." So finally the confirmation went through, and I came here to sit in Albany. Judge Foley continued to sit as a senior judge, and he was a great help to me. As my father was a mentor in the practice, he was a mentor as a judge.
Before we talk about Judge Foley, I wonder if we could go back a little bit to the vetting process by the administration before you got to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Did you find it terribly officious?
No, I didn't. In those days, what they did was mostly ask you about the cases you've already done and the articles you've written, if any, and they knew your background pretty well, but they wanted to see you in person and exchange information with you.
Because the FBI had already looked into it?
Yeah, and the FBI did 100 people, I think. In those days, that was their examination. They'd call 100 people, and the ABA would call a whole bunch of people. ABA would call lawyers. Of course, at the time I was sitting judge in the state courts, and they asked lawyers how I behaved when I presided. They'd check with other judges. They were very thorough also. They were doing the legal qualification, temperament end of it. And the FBI, of course, was doing, are you an alcoholic, drug addict, criminal type of, on the other side. So, but the vetting process in the Justice Department, at least in the district judge business, they didn't ask you questions like, you know, how do you stand on pro-life or pro-choice or any of that stuff. It was mostly they knew that you were of their own political party, and that your work had been, you know, such that they could live with it and it wasn't too far out.
And so you were talking about your recollections of later Chief Judge James T. Foley as your mentor.
Oh, yeah. Judge Foley was an unusual fellow. He was, I think, 38 years old when he was appointed to this court in 1949. He died at the age of 80, I think it was. Well, he was born, he died at the age of 80 in 1990. And so he served, at that time that he died, he was the longest serving federal judge in the country, I believe. He was here for many, many years. He was appointed when a fellow named Kampf died. As you know, my wife and I wrote the history of the Northern District. I think you have a copy of it now. And Kampf is mentioned in there. He was a police court judge in Albany, and through some trick of fate, they put him over here as a federal judge. He lasted about a couple of years, and he had a nervous breakdown. He couldn't take the job. So so they decided to appoint Judge Foley. Judge Foley had practiced law in Troy with a fellow named Goldstein. He had clerked for a state Supreme Court judge named Bill Murray, with whose son I served on the Supreme Court. He met his wife, who was the secretary in that chambers there. And so his background was not all that federal court oriented. And but he had connections with the powerful Democratic machine in Albany. He was always interested in politics. And Dan O'Connell, who was the Democrat political leader here for many years, in fact, a book was written about him by William Kennedy, our local prize-winning author. O'Connell chose him. There was another fellow who was supposed to be chosen, and that fellow that was supposed to be chosen was to be chosen by Thomas Dewey. Thomas Dewey got beaten in the election, and so it fell to Harry Truman to make the appointment. And Harry Truman was much indebted to Dan O'Connell, and Dan called him evidently and said, "I'd like Jim Foley appointed." He liked Jim, and he said, "Sure," and there was no hearing in those days or anything. They sent him his commission, and Judge Foley was off and running. He said, "You know," he always told me, he said, "no matter what they say about Dan O'Connell," he told me this, he said, "You won't be hearing from me after you go on the bench, Jim." He said, "Just be a good judge." He said, "That's the last I had to do with him." And he applied himself to this job so diligently, and he was so good at it that it was unbelievable. He worked very hard. He read everything that was, I would be amazed, and he'd show me, he read all the slip opinions and the law weeks and the cases from all over. And he wrote some great opinions, and he had some interesting cases. He was the fellow who opened up the New York State Police to women. He was good at everything that he did in the law. He was just devoted to it. And when we'd admit new people to practice here, he would say to them, "Keep up on your reading, keep studying the law." And that's what he did all his life. He had some famous trademark cases about Saratoga Vichy water. And therein lies a strange thing. Judge Foley never went on vacation very much or did anything. His one love was the Saratoga racetrack at the summer meet. The meet, he called it. And he had a box at the Saratoga track. And every summer he'd adjourn court at midday, and he'd go up there almost every day of the season and watch the horses and bet on them. That was his big concern. And but he was very helpful to me. We had lunch almost every day. He told me about a lot of things about the law. He told me, he said, just the other day I had some new kind of case that I had never seen before. He was fascinated by the fact that in the federal system, you keep getting things that are not repetitious. You'll get brand new kinds of questions. And he was just an amazing kind of a fellow, and I was so glad to have him here. Back in, guess it was 1988, he was still alive. 2 years before he died, we dedicated the courthouse to him, this courthouse. And there's a plaque downstairs. We had a big ceremony and a lot of important speakers. And the plaque says, "This building is named in honor of James T. Foley, a distinguished jurist of the U.S. District Court, Northern District of New York, appointed by President Harry S. Truman in 1949. Chief Judge from 1963 to 1980, then Senior Judge. A World War II Navy seaman and lieutenant. A warm and enduring presence in this capital city of Albany." Those are the words of William Kennedy, who created those words to describe Judge Foley. A warm and enduring presence. And I think that was so well deserved and justified. He was an unusual kind of guy, very reticent, very modest, and I just enjoyed my association with him so much. How about my cases?
Yes.
Yes,
The
about
cases.
your cases while you're in the Northern District.
Yeah. Well, of course, again, the interest and the fascination that I've always had with the law increased even more when I got on the federal bench, because here we were handling areas of law that I didn't do as a lawyer or as a state Supreme Court judge. And now I'm studying and learning new things and learning from Judge Foley and learning new ways of handling cases in practice. We had more efficiency over here, I think, than we had in the state court, because a federal judge has a little more power to deal with its calendar than the state judge, where this is a much more independent kind of a job than the state judiciary. So cases came through of all kinds. A lot of criminal cases. I had an important criminal case involving a kidnapping with 7 defendants. Woman who, with her husband, owned a Chinese restaurant in Kingston, disappeared and was never heard from again, never found. But the case was put together so tightly by the U.S. Attorney's Office that there was a conviction. That was a long trial. I had the Baby Doe case here, which was an important case of its time. A man, a lawyer as a matter of fact, a stranger to a family, made an application for guardianship of a young girl who was born with spinal bifida, and her parents didn't want to chance an operation, and so she, but he, a stranger, came through and wanted to take over her care. He said it was important. He was a fellow who was hung up with this problem because I guess he had problems similar in his family, and he wanted to take over the medical treatment and save this girl. I threw him out of court with the sanction, and the case got widespread coverage. There are those who say that any hope that I would have had for the Supreme Court was derailed by that decision, but I felt it was the correct one at the time, and I didn't. The people, I guess, who were in charge of those kinds of decisions didn't like the idea of, it's almost a right to die kind of case, and they didn't appreciate it. I did make the short list at one time, by the way, but that fell through. It was a time when Justice Kennedy was appointed. At least I was on the list with him, and evidently he was aware of that. But that was a memorable trial. It wasn't actually a full trial, but one of the memorable things that you have. I had a case, I had an antitrust case here. I had some trademark, intellectual property cases, patent case. Got to run the gamut of matters that federal district judges are concerned with. I had a pretty good record on appeal, but it got to be a very busy court here. When I first came, there were the 2 judges in Syracuse only, Judge McKern and Judge Munson, both of whom were senior now. There was a Judge Port who was in Auburn. He passed away, but he was here when I first came on, and then with Judge Foley and myself, and we were handling all the work of the 32 counties in the Northern District of New York, including the Canadian border and the problems that emanated from there. We used to have a lot of those kind of alien smuggling cases and cases developed by the Border Patrol. But with the problems of criminal prosecution, I think that a lot of cases that were presented then could have just as well been in the state court, but I think that's even more so now.
We would be interested in the facts and circumstances leading to your elevation to the circuit. You were only a district judge for about 4 years. How did it come to pass?
Yes, Reagan was still the president. Maybe if he served one more term, I would get a 3rd commission up there. But he was a fellow who had certain feelings and desires about who should be on the federal bench, and the people who advised him on this thing were very many. We got to know those people over the years. My wife did some work in the White House and got to know them. They got to know about me, and eventually the word started to develop that perhaps I would be a candidate for this spot. Also, they try to get some geographical mix from upstate New York, and so this thing kind of grew. I still had input from Senator D'Amato, although, as you know, the circuit covers more than one state, so the input of one senator isn't quite enough to do it. You've got to get signed off by a number of people, a number of senators who have to be happy as well. But the president the presidents have all liked to keep the circuit appointments closer to their chest than the district court appointments. So this process involved a considerable vetting because by that time, especially for a district judge, they have had your decisions and how you handle the cases and how good you have demonstrated that you could be as a circuit judge. And the circuit judge process is even more complicated because the vetting goes on over a long period of time, and then you're kind of under observation. And then again, you have the input of the American Bar Association. At that time, now they're talking to people who appeared before you in the district court and who had business with you. And they're talking about to the appellate judges who review your work. And they're talking to state judges and anybody who may know you. And of course, the FBI is at it again, although it's easier for them, I think, after 4 years, they just had to update. But
Did you have to talk to anybody in the White House, for example?
well, no, I didn't talk directly to anybody. As I say, my wife was very active down there, and I'd go to Washington from time to time, and we'd have dinner with various people who were involved in the process. And so it wasn't anything direct like that. It was more of that kind of a connection. But again, the circuit appointment is also a highly political process. You've got to be brought to the attention of somebody. Again, I was given the highest ABA rating, but that's not obviously enough to get you through. And then, of course, they got to run you by a lot of other senators, and sometimes you're caught in a process, as I was during the summer there, where some senators want something from the president and say, I'm going to hold up all your nominations to the court until I get this. And a lot of people slide by. I've known of some who were nominated and didn't get the hearing in time, and others who just had a problem because of the give and take that occurs in the Senate with circuit judges. And you can see today that circuit judges are very much in the news because there's now they're getting into real ideology questions that were never asked in my day, probably never asked because the president and the Senate committee were of the same political party, and there weren't problems of that kind. And they were looking for conservative kind of people, I guess, and they thought that I fit their mold, and ultimately it came through. I'll never forget, I was here in my chambers in the district court late on a Friday afternoon. One of my clerks was with me, a fellow named Lego Gagan, who now is a partner of the Dewey Ballantine firm in New York. And he came running in, and everybody had left except Leo. And he came running and said, Judge, it's the president, it's the White House on the phone. I said, is that right? Yeah, he says, it's the president. I talked to the woman, she says that the president's calling. So I got on the phone, and the president said hello, and he said some strange thing. He said, I'm up here at Camp David. I just got here, flew in on Air Force One, and I've got some papers to sign, and your commission is in front of me, and I'm just calling your nomination. It was at that time. Your nomination is in front of me, and I'm asking for permission to sign it. You know, Reagan was that kind of. He sounded, he's real laid back, but his voice sounded different. It sounded like in an echo chamber. And I'm saying to myself, a few people might try to fool me with this. So I played along, and he said, say hello to your wife, whom he knew, and I signed off. But it was a kind of a funny thing. And I got home and I said to my wife, I think I've been nominated for the circuit court. I don't know. I said, I don't know whether that was the president. She said, well, let me call in a favor and find out. She said it was a tremendous favor to call in to have somebody she knew at the White House look at the president's log. And all his calls are logged, just to find out whether it was true. And she said, boy, I owe that guy a lot. They don't do that. So he came back and said, yes, he called your husband. And it turns out that the echo chamber, he's calling from Camp David. He did come, and I didn't understand. I said, the reason that I was so quizzical about it is, why would he tell me he came on Air Force One? I know he goes on Air Force One. I know he travels on that plane. What is he doing besides it's 6 o'clock at night? What is he doing working? Reagan was known to knock off early, you know. So he was at Camp David, and he was talking on a tie line. And he had, in fact, just come back from somewhere. And, was just saying that as a chatty mode. And I think my wife ran into him not too long afterwards, and she said, well, she wanted to thank him for appointing her husband. And he said, I remember that phone call. I guess I didn't react very well, but that's how it came to pass. And then, of course, came the confirmation process.
Judge, would like to talk a little about the confirmation process in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee for your circuit court post.
Well, once again, Strom Thurmond was in the chair, and it went very smoothly. The only thing I can remember he asked me about was an article I had written about, it was called Advice to Today's Law Graduates. It was printed in one of the bar journals after I had given it as a graduation speech. And so I told him what I thought would be some advice to young law graduates. He seemed to be satisfied with it. It was kind of seemed to be a pro forma question to me that he wanted to ask me something. He had a right-hand man called Duke Short who told me ahead of time what some of the questions would be, and it was kind of just went kind of smoothly. They were just interested in moving things along, I think, at that time, and getting the president's appointees confirmed. Duke Short, I remember I shook his hand as I left, and he says, I think we'll see you back a third time. I said, boy, from your mouth to God's ears, Duke. And that was pretty much that process. And so I came on to this court and have been here ever since.